Hello and welcome to this deep dive conversation. Every day it seems we are treated to the latest breathless announcement welcoming a new electronic gadget. Thinner, lighter, faster and more accurate are the potent words and phrases sure to hit the techno sweet spot in our imaginations. From Seattle to Shanghai, the demand for ever greater connectivity, affordability and accessibility has been heard loud and clear. And it is the rapid development in artificial intelligence that is powering this new automated fourth industrial revolution. But at what cost? With me to examine the human rights impact of artificial intelligence is Professor Karen Yeung of the Birmingham School of Law and the School of Computer Science. Dr. Yeung's outstanding academic pedigree is matched by the breadth of her involvement in technology policy projects around the world. Dr. Yeung is the rapporteur for the Council of Europe's Expert Committee on Human Rights Dimension of Automated Data Processing and Different Forms of Artificial Intelligence. She is the chair of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics Working Party on Genome Editing and Human Reproduction. Dr. Yeung is ethics advisor and member of the Expert Advisory Panel on Digital Medicine for the Topol Independent Technology Review for the NHS, and sits on the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Biotechnology. You must have the fullest life of anybody I've ever interviewed.
There are a lot of meetings in my diary, I have to confess.
Well, let me just continue the citations. Dr. Yeung's recent publications include the Oxford Handbook of Law, Regulation and Technology, and she is joint author of the Royal Society British Academy Report, Data Management and Use, Governance in the 21st Century. I'm really delighted that Dr. Yeung joins me today for this deep dive conversation. Dr. Yeung, you're very welcome. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Nigel.
How did you get interested, Dr. Yeung, in the impact technology in general and artificial intelligence in particular is having on our lives?
Well, I'd like to say that it was strategic and intentional, but actually, like most things in life, it was a bit of an accident. So I had been an academic for around about 10 years, and I had built up expertise in regulation and governance generally. So one of the things I think that was slightly unusual about my work is I tried not to focus on any particular policy sector at that time. And then an opportunity came up to take a chair at King's College in London, where they were setting up a new research centre, the Centre for Technology, Ethics, Law and Society, and they wanted someone with expertise in regulation and governance. And I guess I put my hand up, knowing nothing about emerging technology or anything specific about the governance of new technology, but it sounded interesting, and lo and behold, that became my new job. So that was around about 12 years ago now, and since then I have been focusing my research on the challenges associated with governing emerging technology as well as governing or regulating through different emerging technology. So that's how I got interested in the first place, and I've been working on that for quite some time now.
In research for this interview, I've listened to some interesting podcasts where people are saying that artificial intelligence can crash democracy. You've got luminaries like the late Stephen Hawking, even Bill Gates, wondering aloud about the dangers of artificial intelligence. There are other people who are quite happy to say that, this is technology. It's no different to the previous revolutions where we've had technology come along, for example, the printing press, and we just have to embrace it. What's the mindset that you bring to this conversation, Dr. Yeung?
So I think there are lots of common themes that arise when some new technology emerges that seems really powerful, and it destabilizes our sense of how we understand the world and what is in fact possible for us in terms of how we can affect ourselves and how can we affect the world around us. And as you say, we've done this since time immemorial. We develop tools for ourselves in order to improve and enhance our individual and collective well-being, and there's no doubt that technological developments have vastly enhanced the quality of our lives. So there's nothing, I think, problematic about technological innovation per se, to the extent that we can harness that to improve our individual and collective well-being and our social structures. So in a sense, the question then becomes, how do we understand a particular technology and its capacities? So part of the difficulty is that we're always trying to speculate on what's going to happen in the future. Is this going to be beneficial for us in the longer term or not? And of course, here there's a debate about whether or not technologies kind of have a momentum of their own. And once you get on that train, off they go into the world, and we just have to kind of hold our hands up and try and adjust to these new technological futures. Other people are, and I include myself in this, say that, well, actually we make choices. We make active choices, and we also make passive choices to some extent about what technological innovations we want to embrace and in what way. And so I guess because I come from a legal background and my expertise is in regulation and governance, I firmly believe that we have the capacity, if we are sufficiently committed, to introduce, to implement, and to ensure that we adhere to those governance structures that are intended to try and prevent and to mitigate the adverse implications or adverse effects that technological developments might bring with them. So, and if we fail to do that, then we may suffer the consequences. But one of the difficulties is that those consequences might not become apparent for a very long time. And so I quite like to draw analogies with the particular point in time that we're at the moment in relation to these very powerful data-driven computational technologies and the point that we were in when the steam engine was first developed. So lots of people, particularly the World Economic Forum, are referring to this present moment as the kind of the dawn of the fourth industrial revolution that is going to bring about the kinds of massive social transformations across the board that we saw when the steam engine was introduced. So when industrialization was first introduced, we had an enormous shift in the way in which we lived. So people moved into cities, they built manufacturing plants where people congregated. So we moved from an agrarian life to a much more urban way of life. This created problems in terms of how we structured our cities for hygiene, etc., etc. But it did mean that our productivity was massively enhanced, and our overall level of social well-being was very substantially increased by this new machine age that we entered into at that particular time. And so that was something that we unquestionably welcome. We wouldn't want to go back to hand washing our clothes and all the things that we associate with pre-industrialization. There's nothing artisan about having to hand wash your clothes every day. So thank goodness for the machines. That's what we say. But of course, one of the downsides of the first industrial revolution that we didn't recognize at the time was that we now are left with a legacy of a massive climate change problem. So we were simply not aware that the kinds of consequences of burning fossil fuels in the way that we did to power our machines would leave us with this global serious, very serious problem that potentially threatens the welfare of our entire human existence. So that is a monumental challenge that we now face, and we are really struggling to work out how to respond to that effectively. Okay, so I see a similar kind of situation facing us at this particular moment. So we have these new incredibly powerful technologies that could radically disrupt and enhance our collective and individual well-being, but there are potential downsides associated with that move that I think we have not yet come to grips with, and we are unlikely to fully grasp until potentially it's too late. Okay, and for me, I understand that challenge as the challenge associated with pervasive surveillance. So the only reason why it's possible to predict and anticipate our needs and desires, the flow of traffic, how much electricity should be flowing through the grid, etc., is if we are collecting data about everyone and everything all of the time. And it's by collecting that data that we can harness that using our powerful computational technologies to generate insight that will help us to organise our systems more efficiently, more responsively, and more productively. That's all to the good, but the downside is we've collected data about everything and everybody all of the time. And in so doing, we have transformed the nature of our societies. And surveillance, and we don't tend to call it surveillance in this current climate, it tends to be called tracking. But the reality is it's surveillance. And it's kind of interesting that only recently are we starting to recognise that this is potentially quite problematic. And one of my worries is that we're not, because we get so excited about the shiny new tools that can do these amazing things, and because the consequences of that kind of pervasive surveillance and aggregate data collection doesn't really come home to roost until many, many, many years down the track, when they have these aggregate profiles about every single one of us and every single thing we have done, that we start to feel a little bit uncomfortable about what kind of society we've become and what might be done with that data in the wrong hands, or even the right hands that are well intended but are doing things to us that actually we may not agree with, or that we even don't like. And do we have a say in all of that? So I think that the potential social and democratic consequences are quite profound if we don't attend to them now. So I genuinely do think this is a really important moment, and that there are really important and urgent and difficult conversations that we need to have collectively about what we think the good digital society looks like. What kind of digital world do we want to inhabit, accepting that we will have to make decisions about value trade-offs. How much privacy are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of convenience? What are the limits collectively and individually that we're prepared to tolerate? So I'm afraid, you know, I'm old enough to know that you can't have it all. You can have some things and not others. And what we need to do is to make active choices about the things that we want and the things that we don't want, and accept that we will have to make compromises because they simply can't be sidestepped. By definition, if you want data about everything so that you can control everything, then you need to be watching and collecting data about everything. And that has downsides, whether we like it or not.
Artificial intelligence, the fourth industrial revolution, Dr. Yeung, will be sold on the basis that it will make our lives more productive and more efficient. You've articulated very well that there will be social and democratic consequences. Now, people have talked about what should this new digital society look like, and you've talked about the possible dangers of surveillance tracking, as we call it. But what other dangers are you worried about? What other things perhaps are we not talking about that we should be talking about?
I guess one of the questions that has recently come onto the agenda as a result of the Cambridge Analytica scandal is the way in which these technologies can also be harnessed for malign purposes. So states or malign actors can use these technologies in ways that are intended to propagate their own interests, their own views, in ways that might be actually actively hostile towards us. So I don't think we've come even close to coming to grips with this. So it's now possible these systems can do voice recognition so well and simulation that they are able to simulate very accurately the sound of a friend, or your mother's voice, or somebody who sounds familiar, and they sound so human-like. And, you know, it's one thing to get an email in your inbox about, you know, someone is in Nigeria and they've lost their purse and can you please send funds? And you can relatively easily recognize that as a scam. But if you think that you're talking to your mother and it sounds just like your mother and she speaks just like your mother and she says all of the things just like your mother, you may well be taken in. And how are you going to know? So there's a worry that actually we start to lose trust in all of our institutional structures and all of our digital encounters because we're just not confident that what we're dealing with is authentic and true. So that's the kind of really kind of crisis situation. But also I think questions of security, the security of our devices, their resilience, whether or not they perform as expected, their error rates and so forth, I don't think we've come anywhere near really grappling with what that requires. So we champion the so-called Internet of Things, but increasingly we see just how vulnerable these devices are to hacking or to failure or to acting in unexpected ways that we wouldn't actually support or favour. So again, it's partly because we're in such an early stage that we haven't really grappled with these kinds of challenges, but the technology is moving so quickly and the commercial incentives to roll them out and be the first mover and acquire network effect monopoly is so strong that there are going to be some casualties in that process. And so one of my concerns is that we really start to grapple with these questions about, verification and integrity, and how do we deal with malicious use and ensure that those kinds of concerns don't infect our society at a really fundamental level. But quite apart from concerns about malicious use, I personally have some concerns about the way in which these technologies enable personalisation of services. And this is presented to us as a wonderful convenience, because we no longer have to read content that's not relevant to us. And so recommendations are pushed to us all the time, and that's very convenient in lots of ways if they're useful recommendations and they help us to navigate, the vast information deluge that's out there. But one of the problems with this, we saw vividly in the election, in the run-up to the US presidential election, and also in the Brexit referendum, that it enables us to increasingly inhabit our own informational bubble. So this is referred to in the academic literature as filter bubbles, although there is some debate about to what extent filter bubbles are in fact a real phenomenon and whether it really is a problem. But increasingly, it means that we're moving away from a society in which we're collectively offered the same things, that we don't anymore collectively all watch the 6 o'clock news. We don't now all collectively read the same newspaper on the same day, because these services can now be delivered to us in a much more targeted, tailored, bespoke fashion. And that sounds wonderful. What's not to like about that? And the thing that's not to like is that we cease increasingly to inhabit a shared environment. And so one of the places in which this, I think, is portrayed most vividly is in the increasing capacity for retailers to offer us personalised prices. So you and I might be offered exactly the same DVD, book, whatever, you name it, consumer goods, at exactly the same time at a completely different price. Now, if you put this to people and ask them what they think about that, generally people find this completely unfair. Why should I be offered exactly the same item at a much lower price on better terms than you? To which I can say, well, I'm just a better commercial prospect. They know that in the longer term, they'll make more money out of me, so they're going to offer me a better deal. And that, my friend, is called capitalism. And to which we say, but that's not fair. And they say, well, what part of that is not fair? Why should the retailer offer you the same deal if you aren't as profitable as the other customer? And it's quite difficult to challenge that logic if you accept that capitalism is an appropriate form of social and economic organisation that delivers outcomes that we like. So in that sense, we start to become very, in a sense, there's potential to become really quite disassociated with the broader community. We start to inhabit our own little worlds in which everybody is a kind of market of one. And there's a sense in which this may potentially erode over time our sense of community, our sense of having a shared set of interests, and the general principle of sometimes it's really important that some things should be universal, like the right to vote, or the kind of the facts that are presented to us about our world. We hope that they would be universal and shared. But in a world in which these powerful data-driven technologies can deliver us personalised informational environments, we can no longer guarantee that, because the technology makes new things possible that were not previously possible. And that's very vivid in terms of political propaganda. It used to be the case, if you wanted to issue some political propaganda, you paid for a TV ad and everybody saw the same ad. It was very clear who it was from and everybody saw the same message. So at least there was a kind of inbuilt transparency and accountability about that. But when everyone is seeing their own individualised political advertising on their phone through social media, it becomes much, much more difficult to identify the provenance and the validity of that message. And you certainly don't know whether you're the only person who received it or whether everybody received the same message. And so we start to lose trust because we're not able to verify what in fact is going on. And I guess that's the big crisis. We could get to the point where we simply just lose trust. We don't know what to trust anymore because there's the potential for manipulation everywhere. Now, obviously, I've painted a very dystopian view of where this might end, but you can see how those things have the potential to happen and the importance of attending to those possibilities before they become a serious problem.
Okay, so you raise a number of points there. The first thing that hits me from your answer is, are we already in the post-truth age? You talked about how we can't trust, and it's true, The Economist have been running a number of articles about how you can digitally reproduce somebody's voice, somebody's image. I mean, it's astonishing what can be done, and you've highlighted that. But historically, you talked about how the steam engine ushered in a new type of society, a move away from the agrarian society to the industrial society, Dr. Yeung. Given that we're now at the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, who do you think might be the winners and losers if we look back in 50 years' time? Who do you think might be the winners and who do you think might be the losers?
Okay, so I'm always loath to make predictions about where we're going to be in 50 years' time. So with that big caveat, if we continue along the path that we appear to be on, then what seems apparent is that there are some very super powerful players in this new digital game. The likes of Google and Amazon and Facebook and Netflix and Twitter and so on, who have the technical capacity and the stores of data and have acquired a position in the global marketplace where they've become the premier provider of digital services that we in the Western world cannot imagine living without. And the wonderful thing for them is that the more data they have, the more users they have, the more powerful they become. It's a virtuous circle for them from the perspective of the so-called digital titans. But the problem is that the individuals in this game are increasingly unable effectively to exert any pushback or power in relation to those huge providers because they're just single individuals who receive these services, which are based on population-wide data collected continuously in real time. So if you want to try and affect and push back against that, it becomes virtually impossible. If you don't like the terms of service, then you basically said, well, don't use the service. So we have very, very limited forms of exit, if you like, to express unhappiness with the kinds of services that are made available to us. Now, the question is, can capitalism solve the problem? And the problem is, no, it cannot. And we recognise that sometimes the market fails. It fails to take account of values that are not represented in the forces of supply and demand. And so there may be, I think there is a need to reckon with the power disparities that have become all too painfully apparent in this new hyper-networked computational age. And we're struggling to find ways to do it. But we are trying to find ways to do it. We're trying to find ways to do it through the exercise of competition law, through the introduction of data protection legislation, by taking enforcement of those laws seriously. So I don't think it's that we're asleep. I don't think we're asleep at the wheel. I think we're starting to recognise that there are potential problems here. But we're a very long way from devising a set of robust institutional structures where we understand the nature of the problem and where the appropriate limits are. So I think there is cause for optimism that we can start to address these, but because we're in such a new space that we're only starting to come to grips with the capacities and the implications and effects of these technologies at a global level. And then there's the challenge of acting collectively, that we're struggling. We're struggling to really reckon with the power of this technological future, I think.
Is it fair to say then, Dr. Yeung, that it will be these super corporations who will dominate, certainly in the early phase of the fourth industrial revolution? If that's the case then, Doctor, what's your assessment of how the right to work will be treated? Do you see changes in the way in which we see work? Can you imagine, particularly in Western democracies, where universal basic income, that might not be something that's laughed at, but becomes something which is a fundamental of Western liberal democracies?
Well, I'm certainly not an expert on matters of economics and political economy, but I think you're absolutely right in that policymakers are starting to take the question of universal basic income seriously. I haven't myself worked out my position on that, so I'm not going to say whether I favour this one way or the other. I think there's no question that it's going to radically transform our patterns of work and the distribution of the labour force. Whether it leads to massive redundancies, I really don't know. It sort of partly depends upon, or largely depends upon, whether we can reskill those who lose their jobs and enable them to engage in different kinds of work, because I think it's a fallacy to think that the machines will take over full stop, because in fact most of the value or enhanced value comes from finding ways for humans to work with machines to optimise the value that both can generate. So I remember back in the 80s, I'm showing my age now, when computers first came out, and I remember that one of the claims that was made at that time is, oh my goodness, we're going to have so much leisure. Well, that did not happen. Computers did not deliver us more leisure. What they delivered us was more working outside of office hours. So I'm a little bit circumspect about the claims that it will lead to massive worker redundancy. I'm really not sure about that. I think actually the picture will be far more complicated than that, but it's yet to be determined what that picture will in fact look like.
Let me just bring you back to one of your answers where you talked about the notion of pervasive surveillance. Do you think that in this conversation around automation and artificial intelligence in particular, there has been a deliberate attempt to focus on this kind of science fiction, these supercomputers who can play chess better than champions and all these sorts of things, when in fact what we really need to be worried about are these smaller devices that are connected all the time, that offer up so much information? Is that where your concern is, or are you still focused on the sort of the big beasts of the debate around artificial intelligence?
Well, when you say I'm focused on big beasts, I think the worry is that those who are collecting the data are extremely powerful. So, in fact, the power lies in the aggregation of data and having the computational technologies that are able to mine that data for insight. So it's really not a question of which devices we should be worried about, because if the kind of future is one of ubiquitous computing where the sensors are everywhere, then all of your devices will be collecting data about what is going on everywhere. And so the size of the device is neither here nor there. It's more the whole digital ecosystem, the infrastructure that we are building, that is now built or increasingly built in ways that have these embedded sensors, because they've become so cheap, because we recognise that if you harness the power of data, you can gather enormously valuable insight that can improve the way in which your infrastructure and your systems work. And so there's an understandable logic in saying, well, let's put sensors, let's embed sensors in everything we can embed sensors in, because why would you not? And the answer to that is because you don't want pervasive surveillance. But I can imagine the time when it becomes impossible to buy a dumb fridge. In fact, it might even be possible that I start to give the fridges away, which is exactly what they did. Some of the social media providers did in Africa. They gave smartphones away, limited browsing capacity, so that users would have to use those social media sites. The logic makes complete sense, because the power is in the ubiquitous collection and aggregation of the data. You want to get those users in because they are a source of valuable insight. And so it's not the device that matters, it's the continual collection and processing of the data that gives you the power to have insight that is not accessible to those who don't have the data.
You've set out some of the reasons for us to be concerned, but let me put it to you. When you discussed how society or our societies were affected by the first industrial revolution and the introduction of the steam engine, somebody could look at the steam engine and just see that just as, okay, this is going to make the production faster, more profitable, let's go with it. The problem with artificial intelligence and automation is that even big brains like you struggle to understand just where the scope of this, just how large the scope of this will be. So, of course, artificial intelligence algorithms are being sold as helping us to detect cancer or making our cars or our fridges smarter. An article in The Economist this week talked about whether it might be possible to try cases via algorithms. And as a result then, is there a danger that regulators, lawmakers, even academic experts like you may well be dazzled by the potential so that the human rights impact, the social consequences, will perhaps fall lower down in the agenda of priorities? What would you make of that?
Yeah, I think that is a really genuine concern, and part of that is because we are currently, as well as being at an important technological moment, economically we are supposedly experiencing real austerity. And so, because one of the downsides of globalization has been to enable big firms to relocate their production facilities or their headquarters, it means that, in a sense, national states are trying to attract inward investment because that's good for their national economic growth and productivity, and therefore the economic welfare of their citizens. So when money is tight, when there are lots of fiscal pressures, then the response to that has become, well, what we need to do is to drive innovation. And we want to drive private sector innovation because that is going to deliver economic prosperity. And so in a lot of the political and policy discussions, technological innovation is presented as some kind of saviour. That actually, if we just harness the power of technology, this will foster entrepreneurship and economic growth, and we will prosper, and we will get ourselves out of this black financial hole, and everybody will be happy. And so you can see that why that is an attractive policy option for those in positions of power who have to try and respond to this kind of, economic situation that we find ourselves in. And therefore makes a lot of sense to be dazzled by the technology, to put your hope in the technology, to say, well, here's one way in which it promises a way out of the dilemma of avoiding having to make hard choices so that we could sort of have our cake and eat it. We can have the dazzling technology, we can have economic growth, and we can maintain our standard of living. That's the way it's presented, of course. In that narrative, the risks associated with these new technologies, particularly risks that are intangible, those that affect our moral and cultural and political collective life, the quality of our democracy, the quality of the social foundations in which our freedom is possible, can become endangered in ways that nobody notices. Just in the way that the first industrial revolution really jeopardized the quality of our air, the quality of our ambient collective temperature in ways that nobody noticed until it was too late to do something simple and easy to respond to it. And that's my worry, that we will, and it was, there was a great quote that was made by the predecessor to the Information Commissioner in the UK just over 10 years ago. It was back in 2006, and there was a report about the surveillance society, and I think it was the Information Commissioner then who said, we are in danger of sleepwalking into a surveillance society. And he said that 11, 12 years ago now, and guess what? That is exactly what we have done. And the Cambridge Analytica scandal vividly illustrates that is exactly what we have done. And to be perfectly honest, it now really feels a bit too late to put the genie back in the bottle. We've now become so reliant on these devices, which deliver these wonderful benefits, and that's why it's often called the so-called new surveillance. So the old surveillance was fear about Big Brother, about government having its tentacles and cameras out and observing all of its citizens, and the way in which the government, Big Brother, might then harness that those observations in ways that were contrary to human rights. that were abusive. But the new surveillance is not undertaken by the state, although Snowden reminds us that the state is still engaging in surveillance of a whole order of magnitude difference to what we were used to in a pre-digital age. But it's the big technology companies that are engaging in this kind of surveillance, but they do it in these beautiful ways that offer us these wonderful services. I mean, I can't imagine living without Google Maps. And yes, I allow Google to surveil me so that it can tell me where I should go next. And so we do a deal. We do a deal. We say, okay, I'll give up my personal data in return for these fantastic services. But there's a wonderful quote by a Harvard professor. She's retired now, Shoshana Zuboff, and she says it's a Faustian pact. You've done a deal with the devil. You want to do it now, but you will live to regret it. And that is my worry, that I don't want my children and my children's children to live with the serious consequences of our mistakes, of our failure to act. And so we really need to grapple with these things now. We failed on the preventing the surveillance society. We've utterly failed. That is where we are now. So the question is, what do we do about that? How can we restrict the excesses on the potential downsides of this kind of surveillance society that we've become, so that we can preserve what it is that we care about in terms of freedom and democracy and individual liberty?
On this question of the Faustian Pact, it seems to me that this Faustian Pact has been entered into by three separate groups, each with enormous power. You have the consumer who wants to have connected fridges, smart cars, smart devices at all time. You've got the private sector who want this technology because they can see the profits and the enormous opportunities to become super corporations. You've mentioned a few: Google, Twitter, Apple, of course, Facebook, but there are others. Adobe is another one. But then you've also got this geopolitical strand, which we haven't discussed, and I don't know if we'll have enough time. The fact that America, China and Russia all see the benefits of mastering or becoming the master of artificial intelligence. Is that is that the sort of the perfect storm to make your life, as somebody who's interested in the possible ramifications, so much more difficult?
I think that's absolutely right. And one of the difficulties is that civil society in this configuration of socio-political forces is really quite marginalised. So we have academic voices, we have some NGOs like Transparency International and so on, who are trying to express these concerns and put them on the policy agenda. But the greater geopolitical and economic forces are such that one of the problems we struggle with, particularly in democratic orders, that the response is, but China's going to do it. And to which I say, do you want your world to be like that? Is that the world you want to inhabit? Really? Because if you do, I certainly don't. And that's why we need to grapple with these questions about what is the good digital life collectively. What are the collective conditions for a good digital life? Because we are building an infrastructure that will utterly transform the kind of world that we inhabit. And so it's not just an individual decision. It has to be a form of collective democratic decision making. And the trouble is that historically we haven't really thought about technological power as requiring democratic legitimation. We think, yeah, our politicians say we need to vote for them. We need them to articulate what their policies are, and we need to decide, if we believe that we're a democracy, on whether we want to embrace those policies. But hitherto, we haven't done that in relation to our infrastructure or our technological developments. We've just left that to the market and said, well, if consumers take it up, that indicates that we want it. But that just isn't true about our digital infrastructure that embeds values, that configures the conditions of possibility, without wanting to sound too Foucauldian. And therefore, these concerns that we need to democratise how we make decisions about technology policy, I think really are important, because it is a form of power, and a very, very profound form of power at that. And so we need to find institutional mechanisms to do that before the horse is bolted. Otherwise, I think we're in serious trouble, or we could be in serious trouble.
How do you project your concerns, Dr. Yeung, the work that you do for the Council of Europe, for various other organisations, as being something that's fundamental to this debate going forward? Because the globalised world means we're affected by what happens in China or what happens in Seattle. And not allow your work and your concerns to be seen as just the the voice of the joyless Jonah who wants to hold everything back. Do you see what I mean? Because there's so much enthusiasm around automation, artificial intelligence, Europe's place in the world, stopping China, promoting democracy, that it must be so easy for the hard questions to be completely ignored. So going forward then, what's your strategy for bringing this human rights perspective to these very important questions?
Well, I think you've just got to keep pushing. You've got to keep articulating the concerns. I do lots of these talks, try and get it on the policy agenda. You're absolutely right. I'm sort of used to being seen as the kind of killjoy in the room. But in a sense, I see it as my professional obligation. So I walked into a meeting on digital health technologies, and of course the medical profession and the health profession are really excited about this potential, and rightly so. But I always point out that the vision is reliant on pervasive surveillance, and they hate it when I use that term. But I said, but that's not pejorative. Surveillance just means to follow, and everyone starts to feel a bit uncomfortable because they don't want to acknowledge the reality. And so my new line is, and I'll introduce myself as the ethicist or whatever, and I'll say, otherwise known as the voice of doom. And I just see that as it's just a professional hazard. And okay, you're not going to like what I have to say, but please don't take it personally. And I guess you just develop a thick skin about this, and you get a little bit inured to the rhetoric that is rolled out every day about, we don't want to thwart innovation, blah, 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 blah. On it goes, around in a cycle. Yes, I've heard it before. and then they probably think, here she goes again, same old. But I guess that's the nature of public debate and discourse, and that's part of what I think we need to do.
Indeed. Final question then, Dr. Yeung. Does the arc of history bend towards progress?
Oh, my goodness. I don't think I'm qualified to answer that. I would like to say yes, but then there's a question about how we understand progress. And where the progress equates with collective well-being and human flourishing, I have to say, I'm not so sure. I would hope so, but I don't think there's anything inevitable about that, because I think we have to make choices, and we have to make hard choices, and if we don't, then our political and economic system will make them for us, and the arc of history will not bend towards progress that we might actively wish to embrace, and that, I think, is the danger.
Dr. Karen Yeung, it's been a total pleasure. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Nigel.